Well, when I was in high school, I hung out with one of my cousins a whole lot. He was like my best friend. And so when I think back, we did a lot the same. And we became more like each other the more time we spent together. And so we would talk the same, and we used the same words, the same phrases. We liked the same sports teams. We liked the same music. Both of us rode skateboards. We both played basketball. We both liked the same cars. I started collecting baseball cards because he did. He started playing guitar. We did a lot the same. And the thing is, we would spend many Fridays and Saturday nights hanging out together. And so we would go to Taco Bell, and we would both order 2 bean burritos, no onions, and a small Dr. Pepper. Although sometimes we throw it in a little Spanish, 2 bean burritos, no cebollas. All right? Okay, but we did this together, and we went to the same church together, and after church we would go to one or the other's house. And I remember one time we both got genuine leather Bibles. I mean, I could go on and on, but you get the picture. He was my best friend, and the more time we spent together, the more we were alike. Now there's a point to this, and you might have guessed what it is. If you want to be godly, you've got to spend time with God. You've got to be in right fellowship with Him. You see, a godly person is devoted to God from the heart, and he takes steps to be faithful and to obey God and to serve Him and worship Him. And today we're going to see this from the life of Hezekiah. Now, last week we looked at Hezekiah, but we focused on just one major event in his life. Today we're going to focus more on his relationship with God. And by the way, we are covering several chapters today, so there are some sections that we won't read. I will just summarize for you so that we can get to all of it. So we begin in chapter 29. And so the beginning, 2 Chronicles 29 starts with the exact same summary of Hezekiah's reign that we read in 2 Kings. But then Kings went on to tell briefly of Hezekiah putting an end to idolatry and destroying the high places. But here in Chronicles, his reforms, they tell about his reforms in more detail. And the focus is on the temple and the restoration of proper worship of God. Okay, so look at 2 Chronicles 29 and beginning in verse 3. It says, in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east and said to them, hear me, Levites, now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place. For our fathers have been unfaithful and have done what is evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken Him and have turned away their faces from the habitation of the Lord and turned their backs. They also shut the doors of the vestibule and put out the lamps and have not burned incense or offered burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. Therefore, the wrath of God, the wrath of the Lord came on Judah and Jerusalem, and He has made them an object of horror, of astonishment, and of hissing, as you see with your own eyes. For behold, our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, in order that His fierce anger may turn away from us. My sons, do not now be negligent. For the Lord has chosen you to stand in His presence, to minister to Him, and to be His ministers and make offerings to Him. And so right away, Hezekiah gets to work on restoring the temple. He is fully committed to living in fellowship with God, and he takes the steps needed to restore not just his own fellowship with God, but the fellowship of the entire covenant community with God. His father, if you remember, had closed the temple. And so now Hezekiah comes and he now opens the doors, and it says that he repairs them. Now these repairs likely include his recovering them with gold, because if you remember last week we read that later in his life when Sennacherib came and threatened him, what did he do? He took all the gold, including stripping the gold off of the doors that he had put there. So he works on the temple, but then Hezekiah, he gathers the priests and the Levites together, and he tells them to get back to serving God. The temple had been closed. They've been gone, doing their own thing. So he calls them back to get back serving God. But they first need to consecrate themselves, and then they can consecrate the temple. This means, to consecrate means that they need to go through the process of ritually cleansing and rededicating themselves and the temple to God's service. Things had to be made holy or set apart as specifically and only for the worship of God. In order to consecrate the temple, it first had to be physically cleaned out as well. So Hezekiah says here to carry out the filth from the holy place. Now we don't know what exactly was in there, but it was things that weren't supposed to be in there. Maybe it had been used for storage, or maybe it had been filled with trash, or probably it was dirty from just sitting unused. And very likely it had items in there that had been used for improper worship of God and for idolatry in the past. And so he says, clean it all out. But Hezekiah uses two words here to describe this stuff that's in there. Here he called it filth. And later in verse 16, he calls it uncleanness. Now, this word filth is used both literally of things that are dirty and figuratively of things that are spiritually or ritually unclean. But the word uncleanness speaks of things that are ritually or spiritually defiled, unclean. And so it's clear that things had been done in the temple that shouldn't have been done. And things had been left in the temple that didn't belong there. And so they had to remove the filth. They had to remove all the physical junk that didn't belong there and ritually cleanse the temple from spiritual defilement. So then Hezekiah explains the problem and why they're in this current situation. He says their ancestors had turned from God, and they had broken his covenant that God had made with them. See, they were unfaithful. They did evil before God. They rejected God and his commands, and they even closed the temple and quit worshiping and honoring God. So this happened over a couple hundred years. All of these problems happened over a couple hundred years, culminating with Ahaz just completely closing the temple and encouraging the people to join him in idolatry. And as a result, God was angry with them, and he disciplined them. As he agreed, they both agreed upon when they agreed on this covenant. If you disobey, I will curse you, punish you, discipline you. So because of all this, his people, God's people, have become a joke. They become a cautionary tale. You know, one of those stories that you tell and say, don't be like them. And many of this people were carried off into exile. And Hezekiah continues and tells them that the only way to turn God's wrath away from them was so that they aren't all taken out of the land and into exile, was to keep the covenant. So now Hezekiah says he wants to make a covenant with God. But this would actually be a restoring or a recommitting to the original covenant. And so he wants to make a new commitment to keep the old commitment that they broke. And then lastly, he tells the priests and the Levites not to slack off, not to procrastinate, not to leave their work undone, but to do it well and take it seriously. They have an extremely important job, and it was given to them directly from God. He chose them to do it. And without them doing it, none of the covenant community can be in right fellowship with God. And so they need to get it done, and they need to get to it quickly and make sure that it gets done. See, here's the thing. Fellowship with God is so important. And it isn't something to be taken lightly or to be neglected. And this makes me think of Peter's words. In 1 Peter 2, verses 5 and 9, Peter wrote, "You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." And he continues and says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." You see, we were saved to be his people. We are a holy priesthood. This means that we are set apart and dedicated to God and to his worship. Set apart and dedicated to proclaim his greatness because he saved us. And so our lives, all that we are to bring glory and worship to God. This is what life is about. Bringing glory and worship to God. And so fellowship with God is indispensable. We need it. This also means that if there is sin in your life, you need to confess it and repent. 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to do what? Cleanse us. What we've been talking about? Cleansing. To cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so if you need to, repent and rededicate yourself to God. Rededicate yourself to be faithful and obedient and to live right for his glory. That your life may declare his glory. Well, as we continue on, chapter 29 continues on. So the work begins, and the Levites do what the king has told them to do. First, they consecrate themselves, and then they remove everything from the temple, anything that wasn't supposed to be there, that didn't belong there. And they also replaced all the things that Ahaz had taken away to use in his idolatry. They replace those things, and they cleanse the altar, and they cleanse the table, and the utensils, and the things used in worship in the temple. It took them 16 days to consecrate the temple and everything in it. And as soon as the temple was cleansed, the next day, first thing in the morning, Hezekiah went to worship and rededicate the temple. Look at verse 27, chapter 29, verses 27 to 29. It says, then Hezekiah commanded that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord began. Also, and the trumpets, and accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly worshiped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. When the offering was finished, the king and all who were present with him bowed themselves and worshiped. So they offered their sacrifices to atone for their sin, and they worshiped God. They worshiped God singing psalms. In fact, psalms that David and Asaph wrote. And Hezekiah reinstituted the temple worship, following the directions that were given by David and the prophets. And so now that the people's fellowship with God is restored, they now have the opportunity to bring their personal, voluntary offerings to worship God. And look how much they give. Look at verse 32. It says the number of burnt offerings that the assembly brought was 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. All these were for a burnt offering to the Lord. And the consecrated offerings were 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep. So they have this huge outpouring of praise and gratitude to God. In fact, there weren't even enough priests to carry out all of the sacrifices. And so the Levites had to help them. It wasn't actually that there weren't enough priests. It was that there weren't enough priests who had actually listened to the king and consecrated themselves. But the emphasis here is on the great response to God, that this is a day of great rejoicing. Now go down to chapter 30 and verse 1. It says, Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel. For the king and his princes and all the assembly in Jerusalem had taken counsel to keep the Passover in the 2nd month. For they could not keep it at the time because the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient number, nor had the people assembled in Jerusalem. And the plan seemed right to the king and all the assembly. So they decreed to make a proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, that's from the far south to the far north, that the people should come and keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel, at Jerusalem, for they had not kept it as often as prescribed. So now Hezekiah leads the people to celebrate the Passover. The Passover is the feast where they remember God delivering Israel from Egypt with great power and them becoming his people. But they can't do it. They want to do it, but they can't do it at the normal time because they need more priests to be consecrated first. And so they decide to do it a month later than normal. They also want to invite all of Israel to come, including those from the northern kingdom. So not just Judah, but the northern kingdom. Now the thing is, the northern kingdom was already exiled at this point. But there are still some Israelites living there in the land. And Hezekiah sees this as an opportunity to unite all of Israel again. And so they can worship God together. And they hadn't all celebrated Passover together since the days of Solomon. And so Hezekiah sends out his messengers to every area of Israel and Judah. And Judah is challenging all of them to return. He's challenging them all to return to the Lord and be faithful to him. And he tells them not to be stubborn and faithless like their ancestors, but to come to the temple to worship God like God told them to do it. Then Hezekiah tells them that if they return to God, that God will turn towards them and he will show them compassion and he will help them because he is gracious and merciful. And let's continue reading verse 10, chapter 30, verse 10. He says, so the couriers went from city to city throughout the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, and as far as Zebulun, this is up in the northern kingdom, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. However, some men of Asher and Manasseh and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. The hand of God was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of the Lord. And so we see here that some of the people in the northern tribes laughed at Hezekiah and mocked him and mocked Judah because they were trying to do this. But some of them listened and came. But also God led the people of Judah to support all that Hezekiah was doing. They were all for this happening. But as we read this, what we're seeing here again is that God always has a remnant. He always has a remnant who believe in him and who are faithful. And so they all come together to celebrate the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. These are actually two feasts that happen together, and it lasts for 7 days. And so Jerusalem is full of people, and the first thing they do is remove all of the altars in Jerusalem that had been used for idolatry or for that illegitimate mixed worship of God and other things. And so they remove those altars, and more priests and Levites consecrate themselves, and they all start the Passover sacrifices. Look at verse 17. It says, "For there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites had to slaughter the Passover lamb for everyone who was not clean, to consecrate it to the Lord. For a majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, yet they ate the Passover, otherwise than as prescribed. For Hezekiah had prayed for them, saying, 'May the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek God, the Lord, the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules of cleanness.' And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people." So as we read this, now we find out that there's a problem. So not only are there still many Levites having to help the priests in their job, doing things that normally only the priests would do, but also because of the short notice and because some people were traveling from far away and didn't have the time, many people have not been consecrated. They're not ritually clean. They're not ready to take the Passover. They're not consecrated in order to offer their sacrifices for sin before starting the Passover celebration. And so the priests and the Levites, they do all they could, but not everyone was cleansed. But Hezekiah recognizes this problem, and he prays to God, and he asks God to forgive the people for doing things not the ritually correct way. But he asks them to forgive God because even though they're not doing the rituals exactly right, that their hearts are right. Their hearts are right before God. They are seeking to honor God. And God gives them grace, and he doesn't hold it against them. Now, God is gracious and merciful. Now, that may not come as a surprise to you, but sometimes people say, well, not in the Old Testament. Oh, yes, he is. God is gracious and merciful, always, not just in the New Testament. And he looks at the heart. Isn't that good? I mean, so good to know that God is gracious and merciful, and he looks at the heart. Because we don't always do what's right. But God is pleased with our hearts, with the hearts that are devoted to him, even though we're not perfect. And if your heart is devoted to him, he continues to work in your life, and God will stir your heart. Jump down to chapter 30, verse 21. "And the people of Israel who were present at Jerusalem kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with great gladness. And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day by day, singing with all their might to the Lord. And Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levites who showed good skill in the service of the Lord. He said, 'Good job.' So they ate the food of the festival for 7 days, sacrificing peace offerings and giving thanks to the Lord, the God of their fathers." Verse 23, "Then the whole assembly agreed together to keep the feast for another 7 days. So they kept it for another 7 days with gladness." So they're all worshiping God, and they're full of joy. And when the week-long feast is finished, they all want to keep worshiping. And so they just keep going. They don't want to stop. So they decide to continue the feast for a second week. Let's do this all again. And Hezekiah, he provides thousands of animals, so there is enough for everyone to eat and to keep worshiping God. And look at verse 26. It says, so there was great joy in Jerusalem. For since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. So nothing like this had happened since Solomon first dedicated the temple. And this is fitting now, because what is Hezekiah doing? Rededicating the temple. So they had this huge celebration when they first dedicated, and now they're rededicating and they're celebrating again. And so then the priests and the Levites, they pray to God and they ask God to bless the people, and God listens to their prayer. You see, God stirs hearts. When you connect with God in worship, you worship Him, your soul's deepest longing is met. And you just want to stay there. You just want to keep going and worship more. Chapter 31, verse 1 says, now when all of this was finished, all Israel who were present went out to the cities of Judah and broke in pieces the pillars and cut down the Asherim and broke down the high places and the altars throughout all Judah and Benjamin and in Ephraim and Manasseh until they had destroyed them all. Then all the people of Israel returned to their cities, every man to his possession. And so they've reconnected with God. They've recommitted themselves to God. And they have committed to living for Him. And they have committed to worship Him alone. And in their devotion to Him, when they're on their way home from Jerusalem, what do? They go out through all the cities of Judah and through cities in Israel, and they destroy the idols. And they destroy the high places that are there. You see, God stirs hearts. When you connect with God and you worship God, you want to live for Him. You want to honor Him with your life. It comes as a natural, living for Him comes as a natural outpouring of being in fellowship with God. Well, Hezekiah now has the priests and the Levites start serving in the temple again, as they normally should, and in their proper roles. The king gives them his own offerings and tells the people then to bring their offerings to God. Now, specifically, these offerings are the ones that went to support the priests and the Levites. But look how the people respond in verses 5 and 7, chapter 31, verse 5 to 7. He says, as soon as the command was spread abroad, the people of Israel gave in abundance the firstfruits of grain, wine, oil, honey, and all the produce of the field. And they brought in abundantly the tithe of everything. And the people of Israel and Judah who lived in the cities of Judah also brought in the tithe of cattle and sheep, and the tithe of the dedicated things that had been dedicated to the Lord their God, and laid them in heaps. In the 3rd month, they began to pile up the heaps and finished them in the 7th month. And so the people from Judah and from all over Israel bring their offerings, and there's more than enough because God has blessed the people so greatly. So after the Passover that they celebrated together, the people had gone home, they had worked their land, and God had blessed them with great crops and with many animals. And so they bring this great offering to God. So much that Hezekiah tells them to build storehouses to keep all the stuff that's laying around in piles around the temple. You see, God stirs hearts. When you connect with God and you worship Him from the heart, and you experience His grace and His mercy and His goodness, you want to give back to Him. You worship Him by giving your offerings to Him. And then we get this little summary in chapter 20 and 20, verse 20 and 21 of chapter 31. It says, thus Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and he did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. And every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God, and in accordance with the law and the commandments, seeking his God, he did with all his heart and prospered. So Hezekiah faithfully honored God. He was a great leader because he lived to honor God. And he led the people to honor God. Well, now, the beginning of chapter 32 briefly tells the story of Sennacherib's threat against Judah that we looked at last week, and Sennacherib's defeat by God that we saw in 2 Kings. But the second half of the chapter briefly sums up a couple other things that happen in the life of Hezekiah. Look at verse 24, chapter 32, verse 24. In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death, and he prayed to the Lord, and he answered him and gave him a sign. Now, it begins with in those days. This is speaking generally of the days of Hezekiah. Most likely, these two events found here at the end of this chapter happened sometime earlier in Hezekiah's life. So after the religious reforms, but before Sennacherib came and threatened Hezekiah and Judah. And one of the reasons to think this is that we're going to read that his storehouses, Hezekiah's storehouses, are full. And remember last week when Sennacherib first threatened him, what did he do? He emptied out his storehouses to try and pay him off. And so now, this was a very simple one-verse summary of him being sick and getting better, praying to God and praying. 2 Kings chapter 20 tells us a whole lot more details about this situation. And so it tells us that when Hezekiah was sick, Isaiah the prophet comes and tells him that he's going to die. But then Hezekiah prays to God. It's possible that this is the reason that the prophet came with this message, you're going to die. It was in order to provoke the king to seek God and to pray. Maybe at this time in his life, he had gotten complacent or prideful, and he has not been seeking God. We don't know for sure if Hezekiah is sick here because God is disciplining him, but it appears that it might be the case. And we'll see right after this that Hezekiah has a bit of a pride problem. But when Hezekiah prays, God responds to his prayer. And he sends Isaiah. Isaiah had just said, you're going to die, and left. And God sends him right back in to say, I'm going to give you 15 more years. Then Hezekiah asked for a sign from God to prove that he will heal him as the prophet has said he would be. And so Isaiah gives him two options. He says, I can make the shadow go forward on the steps or backwards on the steps. Which one do you want? Well, Hezekiah picks for it to go backwards on the steps because that's harder. Because as the sun moves, the shadow moves, and it would go forward normal. He wants it to go the wrong way. And so he says backwards. And God miraculously causes the shadow to move backwards and confirms that he will be healed. Okay, back in Chronicles there, verse 25. He says, but Hezekiah did not make return according to the benefit done to him, for his heart was proud. Therefore, wrath came upon him and Judah and Jerusalem. But Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah had very great riches and honor, and he made for himself treasuries for silver, for gold, for precious stones, for spices, for shields, and for all kinds of costly vessels, storehouses also for the yield of grain and wine and oil, and stalls for all kinds of cattle and sheepfolds. He likewise provided cities for himself, and flocks and herds in abundance, for God had given him very great possessions. This same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his works. And so in the manner of, let me stop there. He prospered in all his works. And so we're told here directly that Hezekiah has a bit of a pride problem. He doesn't respond correctly to all that God has done for him. Now, this is stated a little vaguely, so it could be about him not believing the confirming sign, but more likely it refers to all of Hezekiah's accomplishments, especially because right at the end of this, it lists off all of his accomplishments, or several of them, many of them. And we're told of all his wealth and that he accumulated. And if you remember from 2 Kings, he told us that he was successful. Why? Because God was with him. His success came from God. So whose accomplishments were they? God's. I mean, Hezekiah did what was right, and he was faithful to God, but God gave him success. Hezekiah didn't do this all on his own, but it appears that Hezekiah let this go to his head. And he started thinking that he was responsible for his success, for his great accomplishments. And he became ungrateful. But then we're told that Hezekiah repented of his pride and he humbled himself before God. This is good. See, we all make mistakes, but then we humble ourselves and submit to God and get right. And it may be that this repentance came as a result of the sickness and his near death. When we continue reading in verse 31, he says, "And so in the matter of the envoys of the princes of Babylon, who had been sent to him to inquire about the sign that had been done in the land, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart." Again, we get more information about this in 2 Kings chapter 20. See, some representatives came from Babylon because the king of Babylon had heard about Hezekiah's sickness and his getting better. But see, it seems that they were probably really coming to discuss teaming up against Assyria. But Hezekiah ends up showing him all of his riches that he's accumulated. He opens up all his storehouses and everything. He just shows him everything he has. And after the people leave, Isaiah the prophet comes and he asks Hezekiah, "Why did they come here? And what did you show them?" Well, Hezekiah seems a little put off by Isaiah asking, and he answers kind of demonstratively, "Everything. I showed them everything." And then Isaiah tells him that he's going to lose it all. You showed them everything, you're going to lose everything. And he tells him that Babylon will conquer Judah and take the Judean people out into exile, out of the land into exile. Even some of his descendants will be taken away to serve the king of Babylon. But he says, but it won't happen for many years. It will be after Hezekiah's lifetime. Well, then Hezekiah gives this strange answer. He says that what God has just said about this judgment, that Judah is going to be going to exile, that'll happen. He says, it's good. But there's two parts to his response. First, Hezekiah is simply resigning to the fact that Judah will be judged by God. And he is submitting to God and his justice. But secondly, he's happy that it won't happen during his lifetime. Now, this second part can be understood in two different ways. First, either he's praising God for the extended time Judah has before judgment comes, or he's selfishly just looking out for himself and happy that it won't happen to him. We can't say which it is for sure. I would tend to lean to the second, but we can't say which it was for sure. But let's go back to what Chronicles says about this event now. There are two things that are mentioned that are either absent or different than what we find in 2 Kings. The first is that the people from Babylon, and Chronicles tells us that the people from Babylon came to inquire about the sign. So not just that Hezekiah had gotten sick or that he got better, but about the sign. It appears they heard about the miracle that God did, making the shadow go backwards. And they're impressed with this amazing thing that they're hearing about this small little country, this small little nation of Judah. Secondly, we're told that God let this happen to test Hezekiah. You see, this would be very flattering. I mean, for the king of Babylon to send people to little old Judah. And again, we see pride rising up in Hezekiah. He failed the test. He arrogantly showed off all that he has. He's boasting of all his great accomplishments and his great wealth. And he's probably also thinking that it would be helpful to have Babylon as an ally against the Assyrians. And so that would beg the question then too, will Hezekiah trust in Babylon and in his own abilities or in God? But we see this problem rising up. You see, pride and selfishness are particularly dangerous temptations because it comes so naturally to us to think highly of ourselves, to think only of ourselves, to look out for ourselves. Pride and selfishness are dangerous temptations. It's so easy for it just to creep into our lives. And so we need to be careful and watch out for those things, for the sin of pride and selfishness. But this is clear to see. Even godly people are tempted. And even godly people, I mean, the story of Hezekiah, he is a godly king. And he had some issues. Even godly people struggle with sin. Even the faithful can be derailed by some sin. In fact, it seems that when people are living for God, when they are being faithful, when they are really serving Him, that's when the devil attacks. That's when the temptation comes. He doesn't want you doing that. And so that's when temptation comes. So what do? Well, we need to stay in close fellowship with God. We need to be consistent in worship. We need to be consistent in spending time with God in prayer and in His Word. We need to be consistent in fellowshipping with other believers who can encourage us and challenge us to live for God and to be godly and to do what's right. We need to stay humble and stay humble before God and never assume that you can't fall, that you won't fail. Stay humble and know that you need God's help, that you need His strength to be godly, and stay close to God. The heart of a godly person is a heart that is devoted to God, a heart that brings glory and worship to God. It's a heart that is being shaped and strengthened by God. It's a heart that is humble before God. So to be godly, to live a life that is pleasing to God, to remain devoted to God, we must be in constant fellowship with God. And then he will make you holy. He will make you godly.